Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading The House of 60 Fathers. And Tien Pao has kind of a problem. He is alone on the sampan while his family has gone to the airfields to work. His dad no longer trusted him, so he took the oars away after Tien Pao took the sampan out on the river without authority. But now the sampan has become dislodged. It is no longer staked to the mud bank and is going down the river. And I'm beginning on page 30 of this book, about a third of the way down the page. In the sampan, Tien Pao woke up, but he was still too fuzzy with sleep to get up. From where he lay, he idly tried to peer through a crack in the matting at the riverbank to see if it was nearly dark, and it was almost time for his father and mother to come. It felt as if he'd slept long. He rubbed his eyes, but it was dark, darker than rain dark. A rushing sound was in his ears. There wasn't any matting at the back of the sampan. The wind had ripped the matting away. There wasn't any riverbank. This was the night. This was the river. This was the sampan rushing headlong down the roaring river in the night. Tien Pao jumped up. He clutched the side of the racing sampan. "Mother!" The wind caught up his shriek, but lost it in the rain. "Mother!" Tien Pao began to cry. Then he hopelessly still yelled out another word. "Father!" He suddenly was still. Hopeless, numb with fear, he sank to the bottom of the sampan. He did not dare shout again. It was no use. His mother and father couldn't possibly hear, but the Japanese could hear. The river was taking him back to the Japanese. With a terrified whimper, Tien Pao caught the little pig to him. He shook the pig awake, shook him hard. Then he held him so hard the little pig groaned. Outside there were only the night and the roaring river and the rain. Wide-eyed and unseeing, Tien Pao stared into the darkness, clutching his pig. He hugged the little pig until his arms ached. The ache in his throat stayed, but he could not cry. He whispered something to the pig. The words made no sense, they had no meaning, but it made him feel a little better to whisper to someone. He did it again. He said, "Beauty of the Republic." He whispered it once more as hard, hurting sob came breaking out of his throat. Tien Pao heard his own whispered words. He wondered at himself for a brief fleeting moment. He'd said, "Beauty of the Republic." He'd called the pig by the name of his baby sister. It was silly, babyish, naming a pig that. No, it wasn't. It felt safer being with something that had a name. He said it aloud, "Beauty of the Republic," and somehow it felt safer. And here's a picture of him holding his pig and looking perplexed. And that's the same picture that's on the cover. But the little pig, tired of his odd position, wriggled out of Tien Pao's arms, jumped to the floor, scampered to the back of the sampan. "Beauty of the Republic!" Tien Pao screamed as he lunged after him. He grabbed him by a hind leg, dragged him back. The little pig let out a long, loud squeal. It scared Tien Pao. He caught the pig's snout, held it so fiercely. The little pig had to struggle and scratch and fight to get breath. "I mustn't yell and you mustn't scream," Tien Pao whispered in his ear. "And you can't jump to the bank. There isn't any bank." With the pig under his arm, he crawled to the back of the sampan and pulled in the rope. He crawled back. He kept the little pig pinched between his legs while he unknotted the rope and removed the stake. He doubled the rope, tied one end to the pig's front leg and the other around his own waist. "We have to stay together," he earnestly whispered. "We might hit something and smash. We've got to stay together." He reached back into the sampan, found the dishpan in the dark, and pulled it tightly against him. He and the pig and the duckling sat in a tight huddle in the center of the sampan. The little pig began grunting sleepily. Tien Pao could not let him sleep. He shook him fiercely, but then in regret held him snug in his arms again. "Beauty in the Republic," he pleaded. He looked fondly down at the little pig. Somehow calling him that and holding him made it feel a little bit as if he still had family. And now it didn't sound crazy or silly, but he shouldn't call a pig by his own sister's name. "I'll call you Glory of the Republic," Tien Pao decided. He peered at the ducklings peeping sleepily in their dishpan. Glory of the Republic and the ducklings, they were his family. It was better, much better than being alone. Storming down the river in a pitch-black sampan. "Glory of the Republic, we've got to stay together," Tien Pao said tenderly. In the dark, he tested the knots in the rope. The wind began to blow. The wind rushed in with rain, swept in through the sampan from the one end to the other. Tien Pao turned his back to the lashing rain, bowed his head. Dimly, he could see the little mirror in the altar to the river god. His lips moved. "River god, good river god. The wind, make it push the sampan to shore." Later, the wind on the river must have changed. The sampan seemed to rush in a great sweeping curve. Tien Pao was almost sure that now the sampan was racing into another river. But in the new river, the wind fell down from the mountains, crashed down on the sampan in one shrieking blow. In one blow, it tore the arched roof of mats off the sampan, flung them down into the river. The mirror of the altar to the river god smashed to bits on the floor. The sampan pushed along wide open to the sky and slashing rain and wind. Rain hurled against the wooden floor. Down from the mountain, the rain came in sheets, in torrents. In one moment, Tien Pao was soaked. He crawled under the bench. There was no other place to crawl for shelter. He crouched under the bench on hands and knees and pulled Glory of the Republic under him to shelter him from the hard, beating rain. He pulled the dishpan before him, kept his hands clenched around the rim. The rainwater rose fast in the open sampan. Under him, Glory of the Republic uttered distressed little grunts, but the numbed Tien Pao kept the rope short, kept him where he was. He felt the water flowing over his hands, clenched around the dishpan, crawling up his wrists. Now the three ducklings flowed out of the dishpan with the rising river water. They swam about happily in their new big pool. One behind the other, they swam in excited, whispering circles through the sampan. Suddenly, their peeping stopped. They became very busy. They dived and dipped. Tien Pao could hear the tiny clatter of their bills along the floor, under the water. At first, he paid no attention. Suddenly, he pushed the pig out of his way. The ducklings were diving for rice. The rice had reached the little shelf under the bench and was washing all the ground rice away. All the rice was lost, his only food. But if the water had reached the shelf, it could sink the sampan. Tien Pao grabbed the dishpan and wildly started bailing the rainwater overboard. He had a scare when he almost scooped a diving duckling overboard with the water. He went at it more quietly and forced himself to make no loud scraping sounds. When at last the dishpan began touching the bottom, Tien Pao tried to save some of the gritty rice that had settled to the floor. He found his rice bowl. He drained the watery rice through his fingers, feeling carefully for any glass splinters from that shattered mirror. Crumb by pasty crumb, he gathered a half bowl full of wet rice. And while Tien Pao worked like that, the rain stopped and light came. Morning came to the river. In the first glimmer of the dawn, Tien Pao saw the dim, far banks. It was a wide river. It was 3 times wider than the river at Hangyan. But when Tien Pao peered ahead under the morning mist floating up from the river, the great river swept into a still wider river. Rivers, Tien Pao knew, widened as they neared the sea. And near the sea were the Japanese. Tien Pao's scalp crawled with horror. When the two rivers finally met, Tien Pao saw a village loom up in the misty dawn. His own village had been at the corner of two rivers. His mouth dry with fear, Tien Pao stared at the distant village. It couldn't be his village. The Japanese had burned his village to the ground, but in this village, the houses still stood. The sampan swung into the new river. The village came closer. But this wasn't a living village. The houses weren't houses. They were empty, blackened, roofless walls. His village. And there, pacing slowly back and forth along the riverbank, was a Japanese soldier. Behind the sentry lay the gutted village. Tien Pao crouched low in the sampan, but he couldn't keep himself from peering fearfully over the edge. The soldier stopped, stood looking up the river. He took his rifle down. To Tien Pao, crouched in the approaching sampan, it seemed that the soldier was looking right at him, that a shot must come. But the sentry merely shifted his rifle to the other shoulder and began pacing again. It broke the horror spell, and as the sentry shifted the gun, Tien Pao made his move. He slid himself flat in the watery bottom of the sampan. He mustn't crouch, mustn't stare over the edge. He kept one arm tightly over the pig so he wouldn't move. Nothing must move. It must be that the rain mist sifting over the river toward the shore had hidden the flat, roofless sampan from the staring sentry. But the rain was over. The mist was lifting. Clear, bright light was coming to the river. Nothing must move. As he lay there motionless, his back exposed to the open sky went rigid with dread. It was again as if he heard the airplane screaming over the treetops. The stutter of bullets, the whining, biting hail of bullets in the water. He fought an almost insane urge to keep his eyes on the sentry. He hid his face in the crook of his arm and lay still again. It seemed hours before Tien Pao at last allowed himself to lift his head and fearfully look back. The village was gone. This was new country, completely unknown to him. Tien Pao looked ahead. The river had become fearfully wide and straight. It must be going straight to the sea now. With the wideness of the river, the current had spread. The sampan seemed to move more slowly. Straight ahead was a deep bay in the bank of the river. There, the water seemed almost quiet. Then Tien Pao grabbed the dishpan. Stretching flat on his face in the back of the sampan, he held the dishpan at a sharp angle down in the river. With the dishpan as a rudder, the sampan slowly began to respond. Slowly, in a seemingly endless curve, it turned toward the quiet bay. At last the sampan rode into the wide, shallow bay. There was a scraping of sand and gravel as it ground to a stop near the shore. Tien Pao scooped up the swimming ducklings and set them in the dishpan in the river. He grabbed the little pig, the bowl of watery rice, and jumped into the shallow water. With the rice bowl in one hand, pushing the dishpan ahead of him with the other hand, and tugging Glory of the Republic, splashing snout deep behind him, Tien Pao hurried to the silent shore. The ducklings in the dishpan peered up at Tien Pao with their black beads of eyes. They peeped excited little whispers up at him. Then Tien Pao stopped. But he couldn't carry a dishpan and ducklings over the mountains. Ducklings were food. If he wrung their necks, he could sling them over his shoulder and he'd have food for days. The thought of the 3 ducklings hanging limp over his shoulder was all of a sudden too much for Tien Pao. He looked at the ducklings. Then he shut his eyes tight and gave the dishpan a hard shove back into the bay. Without looking back, Tien Pao climbed up from the river and up the first rocky cliff. So what has he done with the ducklings? He thought about killing them and taking them. He knew he couldn't carry them over the mountains. He needed his hands free. And he didn't want to let go of the pig. Glory to the Republic. Well, basically, he set the ducklings free. He has let them swim free into the bay. On top of the cliff, Tien Pao turned. The empty sampan had pulled back into the current. It was going down the river. Back in the bay, the white dishpan drifted and twirled. The two ducklings swam in the dishpan, but one must have gone overboard with Tien Pao's hard blind shove. The little duckling was chasing the dishpan, scrambling desperately to get out of the big river back into his little dishpan home. When he saw that, Tien Pao's lips trembled. He turned away and looked no more toward the river. So chapter 3 is called Night in the Mountains. So as he expected, apparently he is going to go try and go cross country to try and find his family. So he has abandoned the Tien Pao, but it doesn't look like it's going very well, because I see a picture of a little boy crying. Well, we'll find out when we read next. Bye-bye.